Hi guys, I'm Danae Brazil and today I'm going to be talking to you about Season 2 of Severance. So I'm going to make this very clear right off the bat. There will be spoilers for the entirety of Severance. If you haven't seen Severance yet and you would like to and you don't want any spoilers, click off now and come back once you've seen it. We'll be talking about themes and concepts that are shown over the entirety of the second season, and I do have to use examples to support that. Secondly, this is not a Severance theory video. However, I do touch on a couple of theories to support themes because I do think at this point the evidence would suggest that this is what is happening. However, this is not a theory video. There are plenty of people who are making Severance theory videos, so if that is what you're looking for, maybe click on something else. I'm solely here to talk about themes and ideas that were discussed and shown in Season 2 of Severance. We're going to start with the commentary on corporate racism and the workplace hierarchy that has been shown in this season of Severance. I think we've had inklings of it, especially about workplace hierarchy in Season 1, but I think in Season 2 we have really seen more of that, and we have also now seen the commentary on corporate racism. So I'm going to start talking about this by talking about the racially recanonicalized Kia paintings from Season 2. Obviously, a fucking crazy thing to be giving Milchick these versions, these alternate versions of the Kia paintings and these the essentially Egan propaganda, but making Kia black is insane. Genuinely, during that scene I started dying of laughter. I had a suspicion that was where we were going, but I was like, surely I'm just insane or I'm losing my mind. There's no way that's what's actually about to happen. And then we see Mr. Milchick open the box and look through these insane versions of the Kia paintings where they've made Kia black to try and make Milchick feel welcomed and as like a gift because of his recent promotion to head of the severed floor. It's a very crazy moment. However, this kind of behavior from a large corporation like Lumen isn't actually that outside the realm of possibilities. I think that's why a lot of us probably predicted what was about to happen before seeing this, because generally these organizations think that simply showing a person of color that is working for them, oh, here's another person of color who's doing well here, is enough to say that they are welcome and treated equally within the workplace. However, this is not really a true attempt at anything. Obviously, we should definitely be seeing people of color in businesses. Using it as a virtue signal of how great and welcoming your corporation is obviously flawed, and these paintings from Lumen are a shallow, low-effort way of attempting inclusion within the workplace, because obviously Mr. Milchick and Natalie are kind of the only two people of color we see within any of the upper management at Lumen. And the fact that they both get given these paintings as some kind of way of saying, you're very welcome here, this is great, is insane. And also on some level, feels like a microaggression of some sort, something that feels really crazy. It almost feels a little humiliating to be giving these to Milchick as if he's meant to be grateful with this. And we see that exchange between him and Natalie and that moment of kind of connection over like, this isn't good, but like that there's nothing they can really say. And the way that Lumen thinks this is enough of a reward for these people reaching a certain level within the workplace hierarchy at Lumen. And I also feel like after this we start to see pretty consistent microaggressions against Mr. Milchick, and probably now if I went back to Season 1 and watched through it more and we saw more interactions, maybe we'd pick up on more things. But I think from that point onwards, after the Care paintings, we really start to see more and more of these little moments that are just very clearly racist microaggressions. For instance, I have a very dueling opinions on the way Milchick has to essentially dance for, obviously, how do I go about this? Obviously, in season 1 we have the music dance experience, and in season 2, in the finale, we have the entire sequence with the choreography and merriment department. And I do, on one hand, love these scenes. I think they're great. I think Tremel Tillman's great in them, and I think he is fantastic in this show overall. And I think that they are the really fun moments in the show. But I also do feel like it's necessary to mention the idea that a black man has to dance for this pretty clearly racist corporation as a means of distraction when they need it, or as a means of appeasement in reference to the music dance experience. There's something about that feels a little like a humiliation ritual for Milchick, that they force him to dance for them like a puppet almost. Yet, I also do think there's the other side of that, where I do think Milchick in some ways injects himself into those experiences, into those moments where he does take some power back, and so it doesn't feel as sinister as it can be interpreted when we consider that the only black man present is forced to dance for this company. I also just want to add quickly that I think it feels especially sinister and a little off from Lumen that they have Milchick dance for them like this, because of the kind of puritanical undertones of the Lumen ideology and the values that they praise overall. Also, I think the other really obvious microaggressions that we see against Mr. Milchick are the critiques of the way he speaks. Because everyone at Lumen speaks in this very strange cadence, this very strange pacing to it. The language they use is often excessive. Some of the sentences even border on being a little convoluted and unnecessary. But there's something about the language of Lumen that's very specific. And Milchick also speaks in this way all the time. Yet, it is very interesting to me that he is the only one criticised for using big or complicated words or complex language as the only black person present a lot of the time, when everyone at Lumen also speaks in this strange, complicated way. We see, it essentially gets boiled down to it at some point, that he needs to speak more black, which obviously is a racist criticism that people of colour, specifically black people, do face, especially in the workplace, that they have to code switch and speak a certain way to fit a company culture. Yet Milchick does this here and is criticised for it. It is very racist to criticise only him for speaking this way. It can especially be interpreted that way when we consider some of the puritanical undertones of the Lumen and their ideology. Forcing him to, shorten his sentences in this way, and I think Tremel Tillman delivers it really well, the way he starts to shorten things like grow up, and the way that, they are drilling this at him. And I do love, obviously, his moment later in the season where he does kind of go against that, and he's just he's remaining committed to the way he's chosen to speak in this professional environment. And it's very interesting though from Lumen to have specifically criticised him for it, when there's really only one reason I can see that they would do so. I just wanted to add to this by saying that I think Lumen does this in an endeavour to remind Milchick that he, is still not one of them at Lumen. It's another way to other the, only black man present in this corporation, and, remind him that, like, no matter how they attempt inclusion, no matter how many promotions he gets, he still will never be considered one of them. And that, it's just another racist microaggression that Lumen exhibits against Mr. Milchick. Now, the other part of the workplace hierarchy that I want to talk about that we are showing this season is the obvious mistreatment of lower level employees by middle managers to cope in the workplace while experiencing such mistreatment themselves. Now, obviously, Mr. Milchick is consistently utilising his power over the innies, and often is not very sympathetic to the position either. There are several moments where he is bordering on cruel, both in season 1 and season 2, because he does hold a position of power over the innies. I do just want to make it clear that I don't think Milchick behaves this way because he is unsympathetic or lacks empathy towards the innies. I think it is solely because he is so devoted to Lumen and wholeheartedly believes in what they are attempting to do and in their cause and in their ideology, and that devotion leads him to behave in ways that can be seen as cruel, not because he himself is cruel by nature. However, we also see on the flip side of that the microaggressions in the way he is spoken to by, let's say, Mr. Drummond. And I do think it's interesting to see Milchick is really the centre point for these two sides of the workplace hierarchy, that experience, and what it's like for a middle manager who has some degree of power, but also ultimately has none within this corporation. And then also the other way we kind of shown this idea and this imbalance this season is with Hallie, because obviously Hallie, as her innie, has this desire to push back against the workplace hierarchy. That's what she's been trying to do this entire time. She very quickly, in season 1, was like, this is wrong that I'm now trapped here because someone else has decided for me. And we see her trying to improve whatever she can of their working conditions and pushing back against the idea that they don't have complete rights. However, she also now knows in season 2 that her out is Helena Egan. So the other side of her is the oppressive force, and the one that has put her not only in the position of being severed in the first place, which she already knew that was her outie that had done so, but now she has the added level that her outie is the one who is in charge of this entire corporation, and this mistreatment that her and the other innies are constantly faced with. Now, another thing that I would love to talk about from this season of Severance is the complicated nature of consent in this show due to how the severance procedure works. Now, in my previous Severance video, because I did make one after I watched season 1 last year, I talked about how no one can truly consent to the procedure of severance because of the way it forms a different consciousness, and how that consciousness does not get a choice in its existence because it is solely chosen by the outie whether they undergo the procedure in the first place and the innie is formed. Now, the part I guess I didn't explicitly say there, but I will be now, is that Severance ultimately is starting to pose a question around consent, of whether we consider consent to be a matter of physical body or consciousness. Because in season 1, we are kind of forced to assume it's a matter of body, that if your outie undergoes severance, they consent to that procedure, then that's it. They've consented, regardless of whether the any consciousness that is formed also consents. They don't get a choice in that creation. However, now we also have another question around consent and severance, which is that whether you can truly consent to anything while severed, because whatever happens to your body, whatever is done to you, if you consent as one version of yourself in one consciousness, you cannot consent in the other one unless you somehow communicate across that line, which we now know there are ways to communicate that way, but generally there aren't. And the obvious point of which we see this conflict emerge is after Helena and Mark hook up at the Ortbo. And because technically this is an assault and violation to both Mark and Helly. For Helena, she was impersonating Helly at the time, and therefore Mark believed that he was hooking up with Helly, who he had already been engaging in a relationship with. He already was interested in her. He consented to sleeping with Helly, not Helena. He did not know that that was Helena. He believed, oh, that's Helly, who I've known this entire time. Helena also committed an assault and violation to Helly by using her body to not only manipulate Mark and therefore assault Mark, because it is coercive and inherently non-consensual for her to impersonate Helly to get to Mark. In the same breath, she used Helly's body for this without her knowledge or consent, and Helly only found out later after Mark told her. Both of them were left feeling violated in different ways because of Helena's choices while severed. And now, well, obviously they end up discussing this, they, move on whatever way they can with that. But still an insane violation. And of course this raises the question, ultimately, of whether you can truly consent to anything while severed. And as I said before, it raises the question of whether consent is a matter of physical body or consciousness. If we consider it to be a matter of physical body, then as long as one consciousness within the body consents, it can be considered just. However, if we consider it to be a matter of consciousness, then a person who has undergone the severance procedure can never truly consent to anything in either consciousness, as the other is unable to know, let alone consent until afterward, and even then, they may never know at all. I think that this is, in my opinion, the most interesting dilemma that Severance poses. Their questions around consent, both as I discussed in my first video about whether you can consent to the procedure at all, and secondly now, whether you can consent after you've undergone it, is fascinating. I think it is such an interesting and complex question that I've never had to consider before. I think it really does give us so many more ways to analyse our understanding of consent, and I don't have the answers for this. I don't know if anyone has the answers of whether we can consider anyone's able to consent both to the procedure or after it, but I do think it's an interesting question to pose. I really hope that the show keeps exploring this idea and the different ways in which consent is affected by being severed. Now, obviously, I'm going to talk about the kind of main theme that everyone's been discussing around season 2 of Severance, and that is the idea that love transcends severance. It is, the overarching theme for this season, and we see it explored in many different examples, so I'm going to start running through some of those now. I first want to talk about, I think, the simplest one to understand, which is Dylan and Gretchen. So Dylan meets his outie's wife Gretchen and very quickly develops a relationship with her and falls in love with her, and eventually even goes as far as to propose to her when she says she can't see him anymore. Dylan starts being allowed to have these visits where his real wife comes and sees him, and they very quickly fall into a relationship. Now, I think this highlights how love can transcend severance in the simplest form, as this relationship does develop very quickly. They have these very short stretches of time where they get to interact, and it clearly also mirrors like an earlier version of outie Dylan and Gretchen's relationship. Because she clearly sees something in Innie Dylan that she used to see in Outie Dylan, and that's why that love transcends for her. And for Dylan, he very easily falls into this loving relationship with her because there's something that automatically connects for him. Then we have Bert and Irving, which I feel like has gone a very strange direction, and I desperately need more answers to flesh this out further. But I do think it's interesting to see both of their outies interact now, because they clearly have some kind of chemistry, and obviously Bert also helps Irving to leave Keir. So clearly there is something connecting them, there is some kind of emotional connection there, despite the fact they don't really know each other. Bert is married, and I don't know, I'm finding it hard to describe Bert and Irving's, because it's clear that something transcends Severance for them, but we have not had enough time. I think with that, it hasn't been developed or explored enough yet for us to see that, and I hope we do get more in season 3 to kind of understand how those feelings have transcended for them. Now we have to start talking about Mark, because obviously Mark is the main way we see the idea that love transcends Severance. So we're going to start by talking about Mark and Gemma. We obviously know that Mark and Gemma were in a loving marriage, and that Mark, in his grief, chose to undergo severance. Clearly, they were very in love, and they were in a very happy marriage. Not without its problems, as we do see more of that in episode 7, but we do know that they had a very good marriage, and clearly, Mark's grief was bad enough that he underwent severance in the first place. In season 1, we do see some kind of care between Innie, Mark and Miss Casey, and that does support the theory. And then also the Cold Harbour Innie of Gemma immediately trusts Mark, even though she obviously doesn't recognise him, has no idea who this man is, and he is covered in blood and seems frantic and insane at the time. But there's clearly something there still where she knows to trust him and that he will not harm her in any way. And now obviously Mark Scouts, his outie, loves and misses Gemma, and he's willing to do anything to get her out of Lumen, which he has done from what we can tell. However, there is now an added element to this, which is that Innie Mark loves Hallie, and this obviously impacts how much he's willing to do for his outie, and we will discuss that further in the next section. But ultimately, Innie Mark does not love or recognise Gemma in the same way. He only knows her as his outie's wife and Miss Casey, and that's what leads to his final decision, which again I will talk about in the next section of the video. But now back to Mark and Hallie. Obviously, Mark and Hallie develop a relationship within the confines of Lumen, and within the confines of these specific severed consciousnesses that they occupy. Consciousnesses, I feel like I've said it a lot, it's really starting to get difficult, gotta be honest, but Hallie is even willing to help Gemma, I think for 2 reasons, both due to her belief in people's freedoms and rights, especially that for Innie's, and because she knows that whatever they're doing to Gemma is cruel, but also because she loves and cares for Mark. And if Mark wants to set Gemma free or set Miss Casey free from how they know her, Hallie will help because she cares for Mark. We've also seen Innie, Mark and Helena have a relationship. Although Mark did believe this was Hallie and was obviously manipulated, it is clear that Helena feels something for Mark, whether that's just because she's envious that Hallie has gotten to have those kinds of feelings and interactions, and she's clearly very starved for that. But also, we have to ask the question of whether Mark did genuinely feel something for Helena. Obviously, he believed it was Hallie, but it's also clear that Mark was either too blinded by his feelings for Hallie to recognise that it was Helena, or those feelings do transcend to some degree, that he still felt comfortable with Helena in a way because those kinds of feelings, because love can transcend Severance. And then we also see that Helena and Outie Mark interact this season. And it becomes abundantly clear that they also have some kind of connection and chemistry as they start flirting very quickly. So quickly, even, that Mark seems to realise that he is, in fact, flirting with Helena Egan, who at this point he does know is linked to Gemma's, death, but now he knows she's not dead, so her absence. So we see all versions of the Mark-Helly combination feeling something towards each other and love transcending to some extent. I also do just want to make it clear here that I wholeheartedly believe that love transcends Severance in both the combinations of Mark and Gemma and the combinations of Mark and Helly, but I do think that any Mark falling in love with Helly does alter the strength of that transcendence of love between any Mark and Miss Casey, because that version of him is in love with someone else, so that ultimately does impact how love can transcend under Severance. Now, I also think that in many ways, Lumen is trying to test to make sure that fear doesn't transcend Severance. I think, obviously, we can assume at this point and all agree that love does transcend, but Lumen is using the testing floor to test that fear does not transcend. And so what we see with Gemma on the testing floor is that in many ways, Lumen is also testing to make sure that fear doesn't transcend Severance in the way we can assume love does. Although while the causes are unknown to her other consciousnesses or to her other innies, the emotions still linger to some extent. We see this through what they are doing to Gemma on the testing floor, as each room and therefore each MDR file contains a fear-inducing experience from what we can tell. Therefore, it is possible that Lumen is testing this repeatedly in order to ensure that different severed consciousnesses hold when experiencing fearful or fear-inducing phenomena. And although these severed consciousnesses do seem to hold, it is clear that Gemma still feels any physical impacts and also has some lingering feelings of fear. However, we don't know if this is due to her lack of knowledge of what is being done to her body, which is an obviously justified cause of her fear, that, if she doesn't know what's happening, you'd obviously be fearful of what has been done to you when you have not been present in your mind in that way. Or we have to consider whether it's the remnants of those consciousnesses and the emotions felt during her occupation of those innies lingering on some level. We also have seen that interpersonal connections of some sort do linger even without memories of the other person. I think that's why Mark trusts PD in season 1, even though he obviously doesn't know him, but he says he's from work and there seems to be enough of a connection there where he cares to listen. And we also know, due to Mark, that feelings like grief do linger through multiple consciousnesses and through different innies and through the Severance, even without the knowledge of where they come from or the memories attached to those feelings, because it's still, those feelings still linger in your body to some extent. And finally, I want to quickly talk about the season ending. This is less of a thematic discussion and more just because I have some thoughts to get out about the ending. I'm going to start off by saying this and making my thoughts on this point abundantly clear. Both versions of Mark have justified reasons for their decision making in episode 10, Cold Harbour. Outie Mark absolutely should want to be able to get Gemma out of Lumen and return to some sense of normalcy with her. That is completely justified, absolutely. One, for Gemma's sake, for her safety. We can pretty much assume now that after the completion of Cold Harbour she was going to be killed or just die because they're going to remove the Severance chip. So absolutely, Mark wants his wife back. However, it is also completely justified that any Mark should be able to choose to be with Helly and not be forced to sacrifice himself, likely as going as far to kill his specific consciousness. Because you cannot tell me that Mark Scout was going to complete reintegration if he had Gemma, when he has said this whole season that his whole reason for undergoing reintegration was to find Gemma. And so it's completely justified for any Mark to say, I will help you get her out, but I cannot sacrifice myself for this. I also have a life and things I value and care about and want to stay for. And for Mark, that's Helly. You know, this life at Lumen is the only life he knows, and he has made the best out of it. Of course, he doesn't want to abandon it. And ultimately, Mark Scout made a selfish choice that harmed both himself and Gemma by undergoing the severance procedure. This does not mean that his decision to sever was unjustified either, simply just selfish. And we also do have an inkling of the feeling that he was manipulated to do so by Lumen. We don't fully know how much they manipulated between Mark and Gemma at all throughout their relationship and through him getting severed. But while it's not an unjustified decision on Mark Scout's part to undergo severance in order to try and cope with his grief, or in this case, ignore it, it is still just selfish. By making this choice, Mark created a whole new consciousness to simply avoid dealing with his grief. However, there are now consequences, as that consciousness that he subjected to this ultimately cruel and unfair existence has made something for himself amongst his co-workers in MDR, and especially with Helly. For Gemma, this decision on Mark's part is also harmful and may make complete reconciliation impossible for them now, as severing part of himself from his grief has also severed part of him from his love for her, and this part of him has now experienced love with someone else. While love does transcend severance to some extent, we have seen that any Mark did not fall in love with Miss Casey. He fell in love with Helly, and now there is a part of him that loves someone else, and we have now seen that that connection has worked multiple ways, including with outing Mark, who completely loves Gemma. But there is some part of that had a connection to and chemistry with Helena. And, by undergoing severance, part of him now loves someone else, being Helly. And, unfortunately for Gemma, she's the real victim in this in many ways, because she has fought this entire time to make it back to Mark. But Mark did not fight in the same way for a long time because he thought she was dead. And what's even more insane when we think about it is that the only reason Mark Scout even has the opportunity to reconcile with Gemma is because the innie version of him sought to free himself and, escaped into the world even temporarily by using the OTC. Therefore, his innie was necessary in finding Gemma and aiding in helping Mark not only find her, but know she's alive. Without Mark, without his innie, Mark would still think Gemma was dead. There'd be no chance for reconciliation, and he would still be grieving this. And at the same time, he has now also helped Gemma get out, which is more than he technically had to do, because it doesn't benefit him specifically, but because Mark cares enough for Miss Casey, that's why he's helping, because it feels like the right thing to do. And so, it's very interesting. I don't know if I've put this very well, but it's very interesting that Mark S. Mark Scout's innie was necessary in finding Gemma and making reconciliation possible for him. However, the selfishness of his choices, specifically the choice to sever himself, may ultimately make it impossible for him and Gemma to reconcile anyway. Because there is, as I've said, now a part of him that loves someone else. There's a part of him that is now in love with Hallie, and that those feelings have transcended to some extent across multiple versions of that relationship. And also, that version of him is completely justified in choosing Hallie and choosing to stay on the severed floor, even though their future doesn't look great. We don't know if there's a version of events that works out for Mark and Hallie, but he shouldn't have to sacrifice himself. And of course, obviously, it's devastating for Gemma and for Mark Scout that their relationship is also, being impacted by this, but Mark made a selfish decision by getting severed in the first place, and this is the unfortunate consequences that he now has to face for those choices. It has been somehow both beneficial to him to be severed, because that's the only way they could have found Gemma in the first place, but at the same time, as a selfish choice that is probably going to harm him and Gemma in the long run. But anyway, that's everything I have to say about season 2 of Severance. I feel like that was a lot. I hope my ideas and thoughts were coherent enough and made sense. I feel like I had so much to try and work through in my brain. Writing this video has been a little difficult, trying to organise my thoughts in a way that made sense thematically. But anyway, that's it. That is season 2 of Severance. Obviously I love this show. I'm thrilled that it exists and that gives us so much to talk about and so many interesting ideas and themes to consider. But yeah, if you liked the video, you can hit the like button, and if you'd like to see more from me, please subscribe, and if you would like to see even more from me, you can follow me on Instagram and TikTok. I'm also a professional makeup and special effects artist, so you can see more of that work there. And yeah, that's kind of it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.